This is a discussion that's been long in the making and an important one, and really looking forward to it. I want to give credit to one of our members here, AK Sandhu, who was instrumental in setting this up. We, as is our way, with our informal networking face-to-faces, we get to know people, and conversations continue even after the Zooms are off. And AK and I had a follow-up talk, and she was expressing her frustration as a woman filmmaker of color in this industry. And out of that conversation, she made me aware of Jennifer and her research with this, the power of personal documentary films. So she made the intro, and we've been talking for months about doing this, and waiting for our schedules to work out. And it's just something very meaningful for us at the D-Word, and I can speak for Erica and the other hosts. If you go to the About page of the D-Word, and I know Julie put a link in there, but you could put another one. One of our core values is supporting and championing diverse voices in the documentary field by amplifying their messages and taking actions to encourage allyship and dismantle white supremacy in our industry. So this conversation today is like perfectly aligned with what we're, our goal, one of our goals at the D-Word. So with that in mind, I just want to get right to introducing our special guest for today, Jennifer Crystal Chien, who is a producer, director, photographer, consultant. What don't you do, Jennifer? And also the co-founder of Represent Media. We'll put, also Julie, you can put a link to Jennifer's website so you can read up more about her, so we can get right to the discussion. But I'm really curious, Jennifer, at what point did your filmmaking evolve into activism? Was there anything in particular that inspired you? I grew up, this is dating myself, but I grew up on films like Bound for Glory and Norma Rae, where there's always that moment where they get the inspiration to do that. Was that something you always had as a goal, or did it evolve?
That's a really interesting question, Doug, and thanks for having me here today as your guest. And actually, some people know, but not everyone, is that I had a different career before I got into documentary film. And I basically helped to support nonprofit organizations here in the Bay Area in various ways. So either through fundraising, through organizational consulting, doing strategic planning, board development, those kinds of things. So actually my first career was doing work with all kinds of organizations that were trying to make the world a better place. So I started with what I guess in the doc film world, you would consider like the community partners that are helping to carry out the impact work. That's actually where my career started. So, and then what happened was that I became really interested in how to extend that impact, because I saw a lot of the same people being involved in those organizations. And I thought, maybe like mass communications, some type of media, something that's kind of creative. And so I ended up thinking about documentary film and getting into that about 10 years ago.
So what was the impetus? We'll have you present shortly your findings from your research, but what was the impetus behind doing that? The field studies of the survey.
Oh, okay. So in terms of advocacy work in the documentary industry, I think after I started making films for a while, and I was interested in certain kinds of films, and I was talking to and networking with other people of color in the field, And what I realized was that we had very similar experiences and similar challenges. And I guess in the Bay Area, there's a really strong sort of progressive nonprofit culture. And so it was kind of surprising to me that maybe in media, there wasn't the same kind of awareness or sort of movement building around trying to create more, trying to create change in a more sustained manner, relating to, you know, race, class, and other types of intersectional issues, gender, you know, queer identity, because that's they often call the Bay Area the bubble, that it's sort of like a bubble from the rest of the world, and that what we experience here is not really quite how the rest of the world functions. Where people are like often very aware of these things. Sometimes in Oakland, I'd be riding on a bus and people would be random bus riding average working class people would be talking about like derivatives and how that, you know, created like sort of you know, the financial mortgage crash and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, people are pretty, you know, are pretty savvy on what's happening in the world around these issues of equity and justice and economics and race and everything. So I think I was just inspired to try to bring some of that perspective to the documentary industry.
So let's get right into, you know, your research and your findings, because we want a lot of the discussion to be like, okay, what do we do with these findings? How do we take that and, you know, create industry change that is sustainable? So so you do you want to just give us an overview of the research and how what that was about?
Sure. And I know this is a discussion format, which I really love. So I'll keep the presenting pretty concise. And then would love to engage with you and other people about the content. And so just a really brief overview. So there's an article that was developed by Represent Media, the organization that I co-founded. Um, and it sits on our website. I think you have a link to that. And it's about 20 pages, although I've heard it's a pretty easy read and it's very graphic and colorful. We also have a one-page summary of some of the key ideas from it in a graphic format. So I know people are very busy. Sometimes people don't have time to, you know, read a whole article. There's also just a one-page graphically designed summary that is also good for people to get a sense of what's in there. And I think in short, what the article talks about is both the origins of why we decided to do some focus groups and an online survey, and then what were some of the findings that came out of that. And then thirdly, I think what is sort of our philosophy or thinking about what this means. And so it was designed not as a academically validated project, right, where it's going through all this sort of rigorous, you know, sort of like there's certain kinds of things that need to be in place for a survey to be academically validated and to be, okay, it's following all these typical rules of research. This is not a research project. Basically, we did a couple focus groups. We did what I would consider an opinion survey. And I know that some of the way that we phrase questions or pose things were in a way that are not necessarily rigidly adhering to some of these standards, because what we're trying to elicit was people's experiences. We're trying to really document and elicit, what do emerging BIPOC filmmakers face in the industry? What do they face when it comes to experiences of race and experiences of trying to get their voices out there? What do they experience when they're trying to get funding and distribution for their films? And we focused on a really narrow and specific audience because Represent Media focuses on personal storytelling in documentary. And so we pretty much focused on that with emerging BIPOC filmmakers who are people who haven't had national, international exposure at the level of like Sundance, Tribeca, national broadcast, that sort of thing. So we're really talking about a group of people who are considered emerging professionals, who are trying to establish themselves in the field, who've made often who've made 1, 2, 3 or more films, but who feel like they're not really getting traction in the industry around the kinds of films they want to make, which includes personal documentary stories. People often ask, well, what do we consider personal documentary? They're not necessarily autobiographical. we define that as films about individuals, families, and communities that are personal stories about those people. They don't necessarily have to be your family. And that the main focus is not a social issue that is defining their lives. So that covers a pretty broad range of personal stories, whether they're about people in a community that you're aware of, or whether they're in your own community or your own family. And basically, we understand that doing this work doesn't cover all people in all places. So when we did this work, we had 26 participants in the focus groups and 51 people who were the survey respondents. So in no way, shape, or form are we saying this is representative of all people who fall into this category. But we thought it was interesting that there were some similarities and some responses that people seem to be coalescing around. So I'll just maybe mention some of those, and then we can have a larger conversation about maybe what does some of this mean. So what happens when BIPOC filmmakers try to tell personal stories? So maybe to some people, surprisingly or not, we found that 37% of respondents said they directly experienced something they would consider racist about their film or their own work. 31% of respondents said that an industry partner had expressed doubt about their qualifications, skills, or ability as a filmmaker. So in the focus groups, we also had people talk about that, and people said that that others would say that they didn't think that they were able to make the films that they were proposing, which we thought was kind of a curious comment, because I think that saying someone doesn't have the capacity or ability or capacity to make a film is a very serious thing, I think, to be commenting on someone who's developing as a filmmaker. We also asked if people have experience of witnessing white people in particular receiving funding to make a film about their own community, if they identified as, for example, like Asian American, as Black, African American, or other identities, racial identities, while they felt like they had a similar film that they were trying to get support for. So across the board, there were different degrees of responses by various racial and ethnic groups, but surprisingly and unfortunately, 73% of Black respondents said they witnessed a white person receive funding to make a film about their community, and they couldn't get support for their own similar film. That's 73%. That's incredibly high. So they're seeing white people getting funding for films that they feel like that are about their community, that they feel like they pitched a very similar idea, and yet somehow they're not getting support. So there's these assumptions in these three stats that there's something where BIPOC filmmakers are not capable or qualified to make certain kinds of films, that maybe because they're not, there's white people who are being supported to make films about their communities. And on top of that, they have experiences of direct sort of types of racist behavior or comments. One kind of egregious example, which when we did the survey, I know it was a few years ago in 2017, there was an Asian American filmmaker who said that she received some advice from a distributor that maybe while she was trying to get her film distributed and approaching people around that she should include fortune cookies with her film. And her film had nothing to do with fortune cookies per se, but maybe that was a very well-meaning comment, but it sort of came off in a very maybe not so pleasant way. So that's kind of around just the experience around struggling to kind of get your voice heard and trying to get support for your film and your ability. So we also looked into this concept that we were developing and looking at that comes from sociology, and it's called symbolic annihilation. It was developed by sociologists, and the concept is that you have public depictions and representations of people in media, in art, in music, in the public space, and the public dialogue. And when a group of people, whether it could be by race, it could be women, it could be queer people, it could be people with disabilities, when a group of people don't see themselves represented in the way that they understand themselves. They either see themselves in very stereotypical ways, they see their portrayals in very limited ways. Maybe they don't even see themselves in certain kinds of media or places or positions or roles in the public space. Or maybe it's become sort of minimized, their role or contribution in certain ways in life, in the world. So that's called symbolic annihilation. And so we found some examples of that in people's responses. 31% of respondents to the survey said that they were actually told their film was less important, their personal film was less important than a social issue film because personal stories of people in their communities aren't that important. That's also just like very, very striking, right? That if it's not a social issue film and there's a personal story about people that you're in contact with in some kind of way, it's really not that important. Who cares about these people? Why is it important? That's a really serious form of devaluation, that just their daily lives aren't important to make films about. 33% experienced someone who wasn't from their community trying to change their vision or story, giving them advice or trying to encourage them to change the vision or story to something they didn't agree with. As a result of that, perhaps, or maybe not as a result of that, or maybe separately, 35% agreed with the comment that they pitched their personal films in ways that were not authentic to their cultural understanding in order to get funding. So a third of people were very aware of the fact that if I pitch the story that I think is true to my community, I'm not going to get funding. So let me change that pitch to what I think people want to hear. And then 24% of respondents said they could only access funding once a white person had become involved with their film. So we sort of see this pattern where people who are trying to tell their own personal stories, or those of other communities who are BIPOC filmmakers, are running into this situation where their voice and their point of view is being devalued. Their stories are trying to be molded into something that other people can understand better or feels more important. And then they start sort of pitching their films in ways that they know are not even true to their own experience and the experience of the people in their films. And so to me, this is really fascinating because the idea of documentary is that you're trying to uncover, reveal some truth, but these pressures are actually pushing people into, I guess you could say, a form of like not truth telling for the sake of trying to get support for the films that they're trying to make and get their, obviously practical issues, getting their careers going, getting some form of the story out into the world. And so I think as documentary filmmakers, we should all be concerned about this because I think one of the points of documentary in my mind is to try to enlighten people as to what is actually happening in the world and what is the nature of what we see out there, and to try to develop and build understanding of the world as it functions and to have some type of compassion for other people. But if we have this dynamic where people are being pressured to create a narrative about their communities that isn't actually true, that fits sort of a white supremacist dominant kind of paradigm, then I feel like that's not actually the work of documentary, right? Is that even a documentary that you're producing, or is that some form of shaping your story so it can be socially acceptable? So maybe I will take a pause there. There's so much to be uncovered with that and some other things that we found, but I could go on forever.
Thanks, Jennifer, for that. And before we go on, I do want to acknowledge Tony Bell, who is also here from Represent Media and who's been furiously chatting away in the chat room, dropping info in the chat. So thanks, Tony. It's so interesting that you bring up this idea that the feedback they get is the stories aren't important. I'd say there's a code word that's used for that, is when they say it's not universal. We hear that all the time, that our stories aren't universal. How is this going to appeal to people in Poland and Australia and so on, when in fact they're basically saying it's not important. So the racism you speak of, I think, isn't like overt. It's very subtle, I think, and infuriating. So I'm just curious, before we get into where we take it from here. Did any of the findings surprise you, or were there any of the findings that actually were, what was the most disturbing out of all of these pretty disturbing findings?
Well, I'm sure there's a lot of, I think, disturbing findings, but I think the finding that I maybe like to focus on, and let me make sure I get this stat correct here, is that I think that I'm not great with numbers, honestly, even though I work with them for a living sometimes. But maybe let me take a look here. Maybe Tony, you can help me out here. But basically, like, I think the thing that was encouraging to me was that a large percentage of people actually felt like that the documentary industry could change and actually be responsive to these kinds of concerns, and to be able to change, and to be able to progress, and to be a different environment. Which the reason I found that surprising was because that there were actually people who came to our focus groups who, there's kind of this thing that's happening, I think, especially with young people, is that there's a divergence that's happening where there's some people who are saying, enough, we don't want to participate in the industry anymore. We're going to put our work out on social media. We're going to create collectives to help support each other to create media. We're not going to get involved in traditional ways of engaging with the industry, which some people have said to me, well, that happens with every industry, every art form. There's sort of an underground. But it concerns me if there's sort of a growing number of young people who are basically saying, we don't want to be part of the industry. We're going to go do our own thing because the industry isn't responding. So I was actually surprised that a number of people, it says here, okay, Tony's kind of posted it here, that we had people rate, how much do you agree with this, right? 0 to 100%. 100% means you totally agree, 0% means you totally disagree. And the average degree of agreement was 79%, which is pretty high, I think, of saying the documentary industry can change to support the kind of films I would like to make. Right. So that actually I found surprising. I thought, well, maybe a lot of people would say, there's no hope, things aren't going to change, we can't do anything about it, it's just going to go on and on in some form, way, shape or form. But that to me shows a great degree of optimism and the desire to want to connect and communicate with people and to make change together.
On the graphic that we linked to the graphic summary, you talk about incremental change and you talk about systemic change. So why don't we distinguish between the two before we talk further about those? Because I'm particularly curious about systemic change.
Sure. So we asked people what were some of the things that they thought would be helpful, strategies to help the industry change. And they were both sort of rating different very specific statements in terms of what they thought would be the most useful, as well as there was some free form writing that people could do in terms of what they thought could constitute change. And so some of the ones that rated the most highly in terms of the specific strategies were, for example, increasing the number of BIPOC in decision-making positions was actually the top one. Strangely, you would think it would be like grants or funding or some type of support like that, but it was actually increasing the number of people in decision-making positions. Maybe because people feel like that there's a struggle with communication, and maybe it's going to be hard for people to really understand and value these kinds of films, and so it's easier just to have different people making certain kinds of decisions. Then, of course, there was creating grants specifically for personal films. And then there's also the idea of things such as having a collective effort, doing things together, helping to support each other in ways such as, obviously, D-Word, as a community. So those are incremental adjustments, right? What are small things we can do to make certain activities for change? Kind of reflecting on this idea that I told you about, that some people have, a small number of people are kind of like sort of done with it. We actually received also comments saying that we need to dismantle the film industry and rebuild it. And perhaps it's time for the industry to rethink how it runs itself as well as finances itself. And in fact, one person, I think she's quoted in the article, basically says that I think she's been in the industry 10 or more years, which is not a huge amount of time, but enough time. And that actually, I think she commented that she felt like that the longer that she was in it, that she felt like it was that these changes are, that the industry is just even more stuck in the way that it is. So there's kind of a small number of people who are feeling like you have to just redo the whole thing. And people have asked me, how's that even practical? Is that even a possible thing? Um, and then we definitely surveyed people on, it wasn't just these 3 strategies, but we had a whole series of like maybe 10 strategies, and we had people rank them. And some of that information is in the full article.
Um, it's so interesting because the industry itself is going through such rapid change.
Mm-hmm.
People are getting their young people in particular. When you say they're forming new ways of getting media out, I mean
Mm-hmm.
they're getting a lot of their information and media from YouTube, from TikTok,
Mm-hmm.
and finding that's like we had a very eye-opening face-to-face a few weeks ago with someone who has 680,000 YouTube subscribers, who was a longtime doc filmmaker, and found it, just totally liberating to
Mm-hmm.
have some of his stuff up on YouTube. So, but I think you hit the nail on the head about gatekeepers. The gatekeepers are white, and where that I think plays out with personal documentary filmmaking is, I can go to a place like IDFA or Hot Docs and go to the receptions and talk about the personal film that I'm making, and 98% of the room is white. So they don't look at my personal stories and go, why, how's that universal? So I can only imagine what it's like for a BIPOC filmmaker, facing that. So it seems to me that there's still plenty of places where you get a lot of eyeballs on your films, and so how is it possible to change the gatekeeper? Do you see it happening already a bit? Is it
Well,
encouraging
I,
that
I
way?
think there's some change to the gatekeeping, and
Hmm.
I think because of my background in doing nonprofit work and working with organizations that did social services and organizing, and then also I think just my perspective on collective action, which is coming from that, but also from just coming from a collective culture. Um, I think there's practical things that could be done, but for example, if people are just changed in institutions and the institutions' practices and culture and values don't change, then the people who are in those positions won't last very long because they're being surrounded by a system that still devalues them and their point of view. And so I actually think that one of the main things I wanted to highlight today, which is one of the philosophical things that we realized when we were doing this research and this work, was that I think one of the biggest challenges we have in the industry is that actually we're having 2 different conversations happening. And my goal, I think, with this article and with these presentations is that we start having the same conversation. And you're like, okay, well, what are the 2 conversations? I think for most people who are um, who are BIPOCs or from another sort of minority group identity, basically understand that, when we go behind the scenes, we have a totally different conversation that we feel free to have with each other that we don't feel safe to have in other mixed spaces because there's all kinds of dynamics, historic, contemporary. There's responsibility on the part of BIPOCs also in the way that we, process things and present things, as well as like white people feeling like, okay, maybe this is really sensitive. I feel bad. I don't know how to deal with this. And so we end up having 2 separate conversations, which I feel like is actually one of the biggest challenges. We need to be having one conversation about what is the nature of these problems, what is happening, and how do we solve them? And to feel safe with each other that we can have this conversation together. And how do we start to establish the foundation for that so that we can work together and cooperate? And because, for example, Doug, if you don't know about some of these experiences and I'm not willing to tell you about them, and I feel afraid of like bringing certain things up to you, how are you going to be my friend in trying to help me to solve the problems that you don't even know about are happening? And then I might get some kind of resentment saying, oh, well, Doug, you should know these things are happening, but you can't read my mind. You don't have my experiences. You aren't in the spaces in the same way that I am. So we both have different roles to play in this dynamic.
Well, let's talk about that for a second. I mean, there are um, supporters, white supporters, there are white allies. I mean, what do you see a difference between just someone who supports this idea and what can we do as allies?
Well, there's a really sort of interesting, I wanted to bring this up because this totally changed my perspective on things, and it's really simple. There's a psychologist, a Black psychologist, his name is Dr. Ken Hardy, and he has this whole thing about how to talk about race or gender or other things when you have this power dynamic happening between people. And so for race, he actually outlines sort of like the different roles of like, he's like, oh, you have different roles and responsibilities. The white people talking have certain roles and the people of color talking have certain roles. And so I wasn't going to really share that much visually, but let me just share this. Um, this kind of really changed my whole perspective on things, right? And I you can find this online if you type in Ken Hardy, and he does this thing about talking about race. Race Matters, how to talk effectively about this. I was at a training that he did, and he goes over a number of different things that are really interesting. But I'm going to start actually with this one, which really struck me. Tasks for people of color. I had no idea, and the more I thought about this, made sense. He said, well, for people of color, there's this sort of historic training that's happened to take care of white people, to not upset or offend, to not like, make people feel uncomfortable, to not make people cry or feel like guilty or whatever those feelings are, right? This has been trained in most people of color for like generations. And so the idea is that you don't want to bring up certain kinds of issues because it's going to make people feel bad. And then you definitely don't want that to happen because after that, many other bad things could happen. So in spaces that are safe, in spaces where there is that sense of where it's appropriate, um, we as people of color need to stop doing that. We need to actually say what it is that we experience and reclaim our own voice and our own perspective and not soften things to make white people feel more comfortable. And so you may not be aware of that, but that is constantly happening. People are assessing and evaluating the room and saying, okay, maybe instead of white supremacy, I'll just say diversity. Maybe instead of saying that I experienced something racist, I'll just say I experienced something uncomfortable at this meeting, right? So softening the language and not speaking directly to try to soften and take care of, soften the experience and take care of white people's feelings. So we have to stop doing that and to reclaim our own voices. And also, I find this interesting, find ways to regulate rage. I had this conversation with a friend of mine, and it was around gender actually. And he said, he's like, I'm a man who wants to help and support women, but I feel so put off when women are just ranting and raging about how bad men are and how bad men are doing all these terrible things. And he's like, I'm there as a man saying, I hear you, I feel so terrible. Like, but he's like, all this rage is being directed at me. And he's like, I'm doing the best that I can. I want to support, I want to support you and I want to do things better. But he's like, it's so demoralizing to be faced with all this rage from women, just ranting on and on about how bad men are. So sometimes that can happen with other issues as well. And there is a reason and a time and a purpose for that rage. When people have been wounded repeatedly and traumatized over and over and over again for long periods of time, you're going to develop rage, right? I mean, that's a very normal reaction. But when you're trying to engage with other people and find a constructive place to build a relationship, a partnership, working solutions, that sort of like trauma and rage, but like my suggestion is that that's healing work that we need to do with ourselves and in our own communities, right? That is not something that interacting in a mixed environment with white people is going to even serve to create that healing per se,
Yeah. For the sake of this conversation, which is a pretty mixed one, can you go to the graphic of tasks for white people?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I just want to start with how that totally changed my perspective on like why do things.
Mhm.
So this is super helpful for white people as well, I would imagine. I'm not white, but I'm imagining this could be super helpful for you. Differentiate between intention and consequences, and really pay attention to the consequences. So often people say, I didn't intend to do something to upset you. I didn't intend to do something to exclude you or to discount you or to, um, maybe do something that kind of harmed your career or set you back in terms of some other thing. I didn't intend to. The reality is that sometimes people's behaviors have an impact or consequences. And this is really saying to know the difference between the two and to take responsibility for the consequences. Even though you didn't intend to, maybe that did do something to someone. Maybe that did actually create an effect. And I didn't mean to, but I still need to be accountable for that effect and that impact. Um, these other ones are, some of them are pretty straightforward. Some of them are resist. He creates this thing, resist empathy, privilege of empathy, which is really about being able to say that, oh, well, this is really about uh, over relying on over expressing the idea that because I have empathy for you, that somehow equalizes the power dynamic or that somehow makes things fair. Um, Having empathy is a beginning point, but it doesn't actually solve some of the problems that we're dealing with. And so I think overemphasizing that empathy of like, well, I have empathy for you or your community or your struggles or your problems, but there's a privilege to that because you're not actually being at the effect of the problems. And just having the empathy doesn't necessarily move things forward, right? Um, Avoid equalization of suffering. This is really common, and it's not done. These are not done in ill-intentioned ways. So there's somebody I have a pretty good relationship with, a pretty good working relationship. He's an older white man, and when I tried to explain to him some things that I was facing around racism, he said, "Oh well, I can relate because I'm not getting jobs because I'm over a certain age." And people are just not, giving me the opportunities that I used to get when I was younger. And so it's like, no, that's actually not the same. But thanks for, I understand sometimes you feel like you're being discriminated against because of the age thing, which is also ageism, is also a form of inequality. So I don't want to minimize that. But don't equate something that you experience to something that another person experiences if it's actually not the same thing. That's not helpful. Um, and this is really interesting. Develop a thick skin, try to like take things in stride. Why? Because um, as the person who has more privilege and power in this society, in the way that it's structured, um, you have the greatest responsibility in the relationship because you have more power. That leaves you with more responsibility. The parties that always have more power. So he applies this framework also to men and women, also to people of different sexual orientations and other stuff. Whoever has the most power has more responsibility to be careful, to try to set a safe environment, to try to encourage cooperation, right? So we all have responsibility, but the people with power have a little bit more.
I do have one last question before I turn it over to the group, and that's, you know, where do we go from here with these findings and put them into like actionable steps? What are these next actionable steps, would you say, rather than having just conversations?
Sure. So I often get, in the beginning of this work, and I think not so much now, but people used to say, okay, well, what do we do? Is there some kind of checklist? Do you have like, 10 points that you want everyone to do? And I'm like, that would be really difficult to come up with 10 points for a filmmaker versus a distribution company versus a funder versus a broadcaster. No, so I don't have like a 10-point checklist. But what I think is important is just briefly, I want to mention that we're starting study action groups, and those are small groups of people who come together to read material to educate themselves about some of this and the dynamics of white supremacy and how race functions in our society and other related things around social movements and organizing. So people basically coming together to read, reflect, and discuss and get the same knowledge base to really try to coalesce around a certain perspective as to why these things are happening, and then to apply that to their day-to-day work. And I feel like that, you know, we're hosting some groups that represent media. Anyone can sort of do this with people who are interested. Just get together and start like getting deeper into like educating yourselves and talking to other people about it and talking about what can I do at my workplace, in my films, in my professional groups, just the places where you're already there. You don't have to go out of your way to do some big thing that, you know, in the industry. Just do the work where you already exist, you know?